Let me bring you up to date on all the people you just mentioned. Times change, but people go on sometimes to very interesting stuff. Heidi Dulé, who with Marina Burt was the one who discovered that there's a predictable order of morphemes in second language and was a very good colleague, now has another career. She's called Dr. Heidi, and she's a nutritionist. And she's written an excellent book on nutrition, and I have a copy of it. And her first chapter is my favorite, and it's all about the importance of coffee. Wonderful. Also, let me tell you about Ashley Hastings. Ashley and I bonded over some common interests. We met at a conference in Milwaukee. We hung out in his hotel room, ate ice cream. I ate vanilla only, of course, and discussed our talks. And since then, whenever we get together, we make sure there's a piano around. And Ashley plays classical for me, and I play popular for him. He's quite a guy. I'm glad you got to know him, etc. And we all owe him a great deal in many ways. What I want to do today is I have two major goals. First of all, I want to make your lives easier and a little more pleasant, both your teaching lives and for those of you doing research. This is a golden era. There is so much happening, and we're having such a good time. I'm happy to announce that my colleague is here, Professor Nushan Ashtari, who teaches at USC, and the research we've been doing, I think, is so very interesting. We'll mention it later on. And I want to make your life easier in another way. I want to save you some money. I want to make things a little less expensive for you. People complain about teachers all the time. They say, and sometimes about professors, teachers don't read anything. What's wrong with them? They're anti-intellectual. No, it's true, they don't. And I know why. Number one, teachers don't have time to read. We all know that. They're overwhelmed by responsibilities. Also, they can't read technical stuff. It's too expensive. I have stopped writing books. I have no new books. The last one was several years ago because no one can afford them. The books now cost in American dollars, $100, $200. I don't know anyone who can afford books like this. Also, the journals are too expensive. If you want to subscribe to the top prestige journals, it's several hundred US dollars a year. And again, I don't know anyone who can do that. If you see an article in a journal that you like, and you want a copy, you have to pay $40 American, and the journal gets the money. The author doesn't. Well, we're changing all that. Oh, there's another reason teachers don't read. The articles are too long and too hard to read. I have trouble with them too. They just go on and on and on and on. So here's what we're doing about it. My articles and the articles of many of my colleagues are now available for free. I publish in what are called open access journals. Open access journals are free to the writer, free to the reader. So if you look at my articles and they're posted on sdkrashen.com, you can download them for free. You'll see where I publish. And colleagues who do research, I invite you to join to do this as well. I think scientific information should be free for everybody. This is what we call contributing to the common good. And I think the publishers have to find another way of making a living. I'm sorry. Okay, it's all for free. It's all there. It's also on a website called ResearchGate, which is kind of borderline legal, but I support them. ResearchGate will post your papers. If you publish them for free, other people can download them. And that's very nice. Okay, let me begin with a brief review of the last 45 years of research. My, it's been exciting. It all begins with a core hypothesis, which some of you have heard of. We think there are two ways of getting better in a language. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're fundamentally different. Acquisition is what we call the natural way. A synonym for acquisition is picking up a language. I was in Spain for a few weeks and I picked up some French that really means you acquired it. Acquisition happens without your knowing it. You don't know it's happening. And once it's done, The knowledge is there in your mind somewhere, but you may not even know that it's there. So it's subconsciously, the process is subconscious and the product is stored subconsciously. The brain is very good at language acquisition. The brain is not very good at what we call language learning. Language learning is conscious knowledge, knowing about language. Most of the time being able to talk about it, telling people what the rule is, the subject and the verb are supposed to agree, etc. The brain is not very good at conscious learning, as we'll see. It's quite limited. Our pedagogy today, and since language teaching has begun, is largely based on conscious learning. Our opinion is that it should be more and more based on subconscious acquisition. In fact, we're finding it very difficult to find a place for conscious learning. Let me tell you what learning does for you. Let's talk about grammar. Is grammar bad? I've been quoted as saying, grammar is bad for you. Don't ever teach it. Teach grammar, go to jail. No, I don't believe that. It's not evil. It's not illegal. It's not a terrible thing to do. It's very limited. That's it. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to learn rules, very hard to apply them. This is how it works. We think we only use grammar when, for the most part, we only use grammar when we're inspecting our own output. When we write something, we want to know if it's right, or we say something. Gee, was that right? Does that correspond to a rule I know? This is called monitoring. If you want to monitor, if you want to think about rules, 3 conditions have to be met. And these conditions are very, very hard to meet. Number 1, you have to know the rule. We don't know all the rules. If you ask the greatest linguists in the world, the greatest linguist in the world right now is still Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky knows more about English, for example, than anyone alive, more than anyone has ever known. If you ask him, Professor Chomsky, how many rules of English do you and your colleagues know? He will say, we've only described fragments of English. There's a lot we don't know. So Chomsky doesn't know all the rules. You go to the very best grammar experts, people who write books about grammar. They don't know all the rules. They get all their stuff from Chomsky and put it in their grammar books. Grammar teachers, even those very enthusiastic about teaching grammar, they don't know all the rules. The best students don't understand all the rules that we present in class and don't remember them after a while. Most people, the grammar is highly limited. Knowing the rules, we know only a tiny, tiny portion. Okay, that's constraint number 1. You've got to know the rules. Number 2, if you want to apply rules, you have to be thinking about correctness. We call this focused on form. This is very unnatural. It's hard to have a conversation with someone or be concerned about writing your ideas when you're thinking about grammatical correctness at the same time. It's kind of like what we try to do in elementary school, patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. Very, very difficult to do. Number 3, you have to have time. If you want to think about rules, drag them up from your subconscious mind, drag them up from your memory, and then apply them. It takes time. During conversation, we don't have time to do this. Now, there is one situation in which these 3 conditions are met. You know the rule, or at least you've studied it. You're thinking about correctness, and you have time. That's called a grammar test. The only time when most people think about grammar is when we give them a grammar test. And our studies done back in the late 70s, early 80s, even on grammar tests, people are not that focused on grammar. They don't do all that well. There's a lot they can't do. Well, that's the limitations of grammar. Let's now talk about how language is acquired, the number 1 question. In my opinion, my hypothesis, we acquire language in only one way. And rather than just tell you about it, let me quickly show you and give you a very quick grammar lesson. I'll give you 2 lessons. I'll use a language some of you may have studied, even fewer of you may speak, and you can tell me which of these two lessons you like better. Here's lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen, und ich möchte Ihnen voraussagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg mit Deutsch haben werden. Good lesson so far? No, of course not. How about if I said it louder? Would that help? No. How about if I slowed it down? Would that help? No. That wasn't a very good lesson. It was incomprehensible. Lesson number 2. Das ist meine Hand. Verstehen Sie das? Hand, ja. Verstehen Sie das? Hand, gut. Das ist mein Kopf. Kopf, Kopf. Und hier sind meine Ohren. Ohren. Ich habe 2 Ohren. 1, 2. 2 Ohren. Hier sind meine Augen. Augen. Ich habe 2 Augen. 1, 2. Und hier sind meine Zigaretten. Ja, meine Zigaretten. Ich habe keine Zigaretten. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. I am now going to reveal to you the most important concept I have learned about language. Not my discovery. I have simply been responsible for publicity and public relations. I think this is it. We acquire language in only one way: when we understand it. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. It happens when we understand what people tell us or what we read. And you didn't have to understand every word. Even if you got like half of it, 2/3 of it, you still acquired. Let me tell you some, I think, amazing facts about language acquisition. Number 1, no work. You didn't have to work hard to understand me, at least I hope not. No hard work, no grim determination. If you understood what I said, you acquired some German, and you did it whether you wanted to or not. Language acquisition is not only effortless, it's involuntary. Given comprehensible input, you must acquire. That's the way the brain is made. A corollary of this hypothesis, surprising to most people, surprising to me when I learned about it, talking is not practicing. If you want to improve in another language, it will not help you to close the bedroom door and speak that language to the mirror. It will not help you to repeat things again and again to yourself. We acquire by input, not by output. Okay? Our ability to speak is the result of language acquisition, not the cause. Let me give credit where credit is due here. In the field of literacy, people such as Kenneth Goodman and Frank Smith had this idea, more than 10 years before I did. I remember when I first read Frank Smith's books on literacy, Reading Without Nonsense, great title. I saw all my ideas there, everything that I had ever thought of, all there 10 years before I did, expressed very clearly and from a neighboring field, from different kinds of evidence. It was quite a glorious day, very exciting. Other people have had the same idea as well. In our field, Pitt Corder from the UK had very similar ideas. Leonard Newmark, professor from San Diego, had interesting thoughts about this and had very, very similar ideas. I'll tell you a very strange thing about Leonard Newmark. I lived for a long time in West Los Angeles, and my uncle and aunt, my uncle Boris and Aunt Ann Boris Newmark, get it, had their 50th wedding anniversary. So I went to the local synagogue where they had their big 50th anniversary party, walked in the door, there was Leonard Newmark. I said, Leonard, what are you doing here? He said, Steve, what are you doing here? And I said, it's my aunt and uncle's anniversary. He said, no, it's my aunt and uncle's anniversary. We had the same idea, isn't this bizarre? And pretty much around the same time. He had it a little before I did, and we're kind of related in that way. Okay, we've made some progress in the last few years, and I think this is an exciting step forward. And I owe a lot of this to my colleague, Benico Mason. Comprehensible does not guarantee the best input. We say you acquire language from comprehensible input, but some kinds of comprehensible input are better than others. And we now have a new term called optimal input. The input that's the most efficient, gets you there the quickest, and works the best. Optimal input, we have hypothesized, has 4 features. Of course, it's comprehensible. Number 2, it's interesting. And I owe this to Leonard Newmark. He said, what we want to do in classes, if it's done through input, we want to make sure students pay attention to the input. The best way of making sure students pay attention to the input, make sure it's interesting. Sometimes I think we go out of our way to do the opposite, make it boring. No, make sure you're saying things that people really want to hear. In fact, I think interesting may not be strong enough. Make it so interesting that students actually forget that they're listening to or reading another language. The term I like, compelling input. So interesting, you're focused only on the message. A third characteristic, Dr. Mason says, input should be rich. To me, that means a couple of things. Number 1, the input contains details that makes the text or what you're saying more comprehensible and more interesting. A good story, an interesting discussion, and text that helps you understand it. That doesn't mean you're going to understand every word. We can tolerate little bits of noise in the input, but it has to be rich with a lot of language there. 3, 4, there has to be a lot of it. We call this abundant. Here's the reason. Researchers, various places, most interesting from the University of Illinois, Richard Anderson and his team, have pointed out, and they have evidence, that language acquisition happens gradually. It doesn't happen from one exposure to a new word, one exposure to a new grammatical idea. It happens a little bit at a time. They claim, their conclusion is that each time you hear or read a new word, a word that's unfamiliar to you, you see it in print, you hear it used, you get a little piece of it. You might get 5% of the meaning and the form. That means once is not going to be enough. And they have data that I think shows this quite clearly, and we have replicated this in second language acquisition. So there has to be a lot of it. It has to be abundant. Now, what kinds of input satisfy these conditions? 2 kinds. These are not the only way to acquire, but they might be the most efficient, okay? Number 1, stories. In fact, it's stories all the way down. Hearing stories, listening to stories. Number 2, reading stories. Let me now run to application, tell you what we're doing these days. We divide application into 2 stages. Stage 1, listening to stories. We all remember this. When we were little kids, we heard stories all around. I grew up with stories everywhere. I had a very privileged, easy life. I still do. I have a very easy incarnation. I must have had difficult previous lives before this because I've definitely been given a break on this one. It's been a lot of fun and very easy. Anyway, I had stories everywhere. Mommy and Daddy told me stories, read me stories. My sister made sure I heard stories, 4 years older than I am. I've got to call her today, I will. She took me to the library when I was 9 years old and got me my first library card. Isn't that wonderful? She got me involved in stories on the radio. Mom and Dad told me stories. There were stories everywhere. Now, we regard this as a wonderful way of starting language teaching. The beginning stage of many methods today are stories, fiction, stories. I'll tell you about one of them, and this was designed by Benico Mason, my colleague in Japan. She has developed something called story listening. Let me tell you what happens. In story listening, you choose stories that are of universal interest, that everyone is going to like. She likes to use fairy tales, Grimm's tales, etc. And she prepares them to make sure they're comprehensible. When there's a new word in the story that she thinks a lot of the students won't know, she's prepared in advance. She'll use what we call comprehension aiding supplementation. Draw a picture to illustrate the word. Define it, use paraphrase, describe it. And since she speaks the same native language as her students do, a translation every so often. It's not word by word translation all the way through, but when you get stuck, it's okay to translate. Here's what she has found. If you do this, and if there's no focus on remembering vocabulary, the students are not told, you've got to know these words at the end. They don't write down the words, make flashcards, etc. If you do this, people pick up vocabulary very, very well. If you add vocabulary exercises, sometimes we do that. We tell a story and then we have exercises so students can practice the vocabulary afterwards, draw a line from a word to the definition, write 3 sentences with every word, etc. It's not as good. The time is better spent on more stories. Isn't that exciting? We have more acquisition from hearing stories than from doing skill-based exercises to have students master vocabulary consciously. So this is what we do in the first stage. This stage leads to a second stage that I'm very excited about. I've been experimenting on myself with this and I'll tell you about it. Second stage is reading. Let me first give you the conclusions on research on reading. And this is self-selected pleasure reading. That is the main thing. Selected by you, which makes sure it is compelling and it's reading for pleasure. So it's going to be interesting right from the start. And again, this is kind of the low intermediate stage or advanced beginner stage. Students have heard stories, they've got some language, etc. Self-selected, a word on this. I read a passage written by an American humorist, Garrison Keillor, very funny. He says, when my friends find out that I was an English literature major in college, I get lots of gifts of classical literature. The Bronte sisters, early plays by Shakespeare, and they're sitting on my shelf at home. And I walk by the shelf and I can feel the books staring down at me, making me feel guilty because I haven't read any of them. We don't like to read books that people give us to read. You've got to read this book. This is a great story. No, we have to select it ourselves. Then we know it's going to be right for us. In fact, when people recommend books to me, if it's a professional book, I kind of pause because sometimes it is just right. Okay, like please read this article by Frank Smith. It's wonderful. And if it's someone I really trust, and I do have colleagues like this, I will do it. But when it's fiction, when it's storybooks, no. And what I dread, what I'm afraid of, the person who gave me the book a couple of weeks later is going to say, Steve, how did you like that book I gave you? And of course, I haven't read it, of course. So it has to be self-selected. Now, in terms of fiction, there is one person, I have an exception to this. There's one person, when he recommends a book to me, I always read it right away. I always go out and get a copy. He's been right every single time. And he knows me better than I know myself. And he knows exactly what I should be reading, and he's always right. And that's my son. He's been doing this to me for quite a long time and absolutely right. But these people are rare in your life. Gift books are assigned reading. That's the problem. Self-selected fiction is by far the secret to all of this. Self-selected pleasure reading, the results of the research, is the cause of our vocabulary development, our grammatical development, our writing style, and our spelling. Very interesting. It's also a tremendous source of knowledge. Studies from Keith Stanovich, University of Michigan. People who read more fiction know more. They know more about nearly everything. Of course, they know more about literature. That makes sense. They know more about science. They know more about history. They know more about practical matters. Other research shows, and this has been the last few years, that people who read lots of fiction have superior, we call this habits of mind. If you read lots of fiction, first of all, you avoid simple solutions. You have a better sense of what other people are thinking. You're more empathic. Reason for this, it's happened to all of you. You read a very good fictional book and you live the life of the narrator or of the protagonist. You go through the same problem solving that the protagonist does. You get to meet a lot of people this way, and you get to live through someone else's experiences. Chomsky, once again, quoting Noam Chomsky, says, we will probably find out that reading fiction, reading novels, gives us a better sense of how the human brain works than reading academic psychology. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I have discovered fiction in the last 20 years, really a lot of it, because I've started to do, well, until COVID virus, started to do a lot of driving. If I want to go into Los Angeles and I want to go to two important places, number one, to see my grandchildren, my daughter, her husband, and I want to go to Gold's Gym, one of the most important places on earth for me, I have to drive about 35, 40 minutes each way. That gets pretty boring. So go to the local library and I've gotten audiobooks. I've been listening to audiobooks. And when you're driving, you can't do heavy philosophical things. So I've been listening to popular novels, and I have discovered how good they are. I've been reading novels about lawyers. I've been reading doctor novels, detective stories, or listening to them in the car. It all began, of course, with Harry Potter, when Harry Potter came out in the form of audiobook. So good that when you go into your driveway at home, you might sit there for a couple of minutes and hear the end of that chapter. And I'm filled with respect at the incredible ingenuity and intelligence of bestseller fiction writers. And I have learned a lot from them. And now I see why. I got to tell you about one of my greatest accomplishments. I'm very proud of this. The Washington Post had letters to the editor, a series of them published criticizing them. The Post had commented on the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and his habit of making spelling mistakes in his tweets. Gosh, I think last night he did 40 tweets. He just went crazier than usual. And they're filled with spelling mistakes. He doesn't edit them. People wrote in, don't be too hard on him. It's only spelling. All he needs is a spell check or a secretary to correct the spelling. People felt the Post was being too hard on him. So I wrote a letter to the editor to the Washington Post. You can find it on my website, sdkrashen.com, and it got published. I was so happy. It said, spelling is not a trivial matter. What we have found from our research is that people who read more spell better, and a lot of it comes from reading, getting a feel for words. It's not that if you read a lot, you'll be a perfect speller, but you'll be a lot better than someone who hasn't read a lot. Also, I repeated what I told you, that speed, it's the source of our vocabulary, the source of our knowledge of grammar, our writing style. I also said, as I told you, that people who read more know more. They know more about history. They know more about geography. And as we have seen, Mr. Trump is not terribly well informed about anything. Science, oh my goodness. His pronouncements about the coronavirus, don't listen to him if you get the coronavirus, let me tell you. His knowledge of politics, history, geography is very, very weak. I remember a few years ago, he was in Israel and he told his host there, He said, well, I'm leaving now and I'm going off to the Middle East. Where do you think you are now? Okay, it's errors like this all the time. So I wrote the letter. Oh yes, habits of mind. Let me talk about that. Um, Being empathic to other people. You know, he's very insulting toward just about everybody. And simple solutions. He is the master of simple solutions. We'll build a wall. We'll do this. We'll do that. And his pronouncements are naive. I think a lot of people agree with that. And they change all the time. He'll contradict himself. My conclusion was, Mr. Trump is not a reader. And it shows. And this has hurt all of us. They published it. I've been waiting for him to block me on Twitter, but it hasn't happened yet. So this is a big deal. The research on reading supports this, and it is, oh, by the way, I should talk about my habit of criticizing the President of the United States. A previous president, Theodore Roosevelt, wrote that criticizing the President of the United States is an obligation. If the president is doing things and you disagree, it is your obligation as a patriotic citizen to bring forth a coherent argument as to what the mistake was. Not doing it, Roosevelt said, is treasonous. So it's quite the opposite. So I'm simply fulfilling my obligation as a patriotic American citizen and, of course, citizen of the world. Let me give you some of the research on this. The first study is by my colleague, Benico Mason. We co-authored the paper, but we co-authored in a way I like. The other person does the work, I get the credit. That's what happened. Dr. Mason, as part of her obligation at her university in Japan, taught a class in English as a foreign language, EFL. And people came, this is a great idea for a professor to do. People came in from the community and took the class, ordinary civilian people, not professors. The class itself was stories in the way she likes to do it. And the homework was reading lots and lots of easy, simple books, what we call graded readers. A few of the students asked her at the end of the class, would she hang in with them for a while? They wanted to continue reading on their own. Would she recommend books, give them advice? She said, wonderful. Except she said, I'd like you to do something for me. Take what's called the TOEIC examination, standardized test of English, not a bad one, the listening comprehension reading part, and then retake it every so often. We'd like to see your progress and write down what you've read, what the titles were. From that, we were able to estimate the amount of time people put in reading. Now, the TOEIC, some of you know about, goes from 0 to 1,000 in terms of points. If you're at 250, that means you're ready to start easy reading. If you're up to 800, 900, you have arrived. You have academic English. You're okay. Here is what the results were. Her students read anywhere from a couple of months to a year and a half. They ranged in age from, the youngest was, I think, in his 20s. The oldest, 76, my kind of guy, okay? And they read all kinds of stuff. They read graded readers. They read easy novels. Another guy I'd like to meet, most of his reading was romance novels. That guy must be pretty interesting, let me tell you. Anyway, here's what we found. For every hour you read, you gained more than a half a point on the TOEIC, 0.6 of a point. Recent replication now, Dr. Mason has found that it's 0.7 points per hour. Wow, that means if you read an hour a day for a few months, you gain 50, 60 points. If you do it for a year, 2 years, 3 years, you put in a couple of hours, you can go from the lower levels of TOEIC all the way to the top of academic language. Now, this is having a good time. My colleague, Jeff McQuillan, wrote a paper. He called it the Starbucks method. Go to Starbucks, order some coffee, relax, read a good book. Much more profitable than going to a class, doing the exercises, et cetera. So that's a good one. A study done in London, University of London, found similar results. I'm just giving you some of the highlights here. They found, this group of scientists, very dedicated, They had the same group of subjects since they were like tiny tots, little kids, all the way, followed them for 40 plus years. Okay. The last time, so they could compare early test scores, later test scores. The last time they did it, they wrote a pamphlet on it. They found that they gave them tests of vocabulary, English vocabulary, first language. The best predictor of vocabulary was reading. And the kind of reading that counted the most, you know what I'm going to say? Fiction. Not junk fiction, but they called it middlebrow fiction, worked very, very well. In fact, it worked better than nonfiction. Wow. And the push in the United States has been nonfiction. Fiction is only for weaklings. Nonfiction counts. You'll get academic language, etc. Turns out that the stuff that we like the best turns out to be very, very profitable. People are worried about scientific literacy, academic literacy. Turns out that fiction reading is the path. A study that Dr. McQuillan found, Rolls and Rogers are the authors. Jeff's article is in Reading Matrix. Where do we get our academic vocabulary? He compared direct instruction and reading for pleasure. Reading for pleasure won, in fact, easily. One study he found, the authors estimated that if you read 1 million words, that's about a year's reading for a competent reader. If you read 1 million words of science fiction, you get about half, for about a year, you get about half of the scientific academic vocabulary that you need for all fields of science. So they found too that science fiction was the bridge. You know, stories that you listen to, not very complicated, tough scientific articles at the other extreme. Reading science fiction is right in the middle. So it's a wonderful bridge. It makes reading the hard stuff much, much more comprehensible. Let me turn the page. Excuse me. Okay, and we also know that you've heard that reading gives you knowledge, etc. Let me tell you the first stage of Dr. Mason's reading program, which I think is really useful, and I've been using it with myself. You don't start by telling kids, go to the library and select whatever you like. You guide them. She calls it guided self-selected reading, where students who are still at beginning stages, say low, intermediate, advanced beginner, don't go into the library and pick anything. Too hard. They are guided with the help of a good teacher who knows the students and knows their interests toward books that they will like, that they'll find comprehensible. And you do a lot of it. When I did high school foreign language, I remember taking French in high school. By the way, I was not a good student in French. I was given a passing grade after 2 years of French if I promised to never study French again at that secondary school, because I would embarrass the teacher. Et maintenant, je parle français. Okay, ça va très bien. I have no problems with French, but that didn't come from my high school instruction, okay? Anyway, you look at the first chapter of our French book, I remember it vividly. Boring, 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 boring. You know, Monsieur and Madame Dupont and their boring children who did all these uninteresting things all day. It was to have you practice the new vocabulary, have you practice the new grammar. And it's very hard to make things interesting when you're doing that, okay? So she begins with graded readers, easy, and a lot of them. Her students don't read one story. They may read 100, 200, 300 stories before they get into so-called authentic reading. That's what we're talking about. A huge amount of very easy reading is the secret. Now, I've been experimenting on myself during the COVID times. Like most people, I've been home. I kind of like it. I've been having a good time. I've been doing a couple of things at home. Oh, this thing about isolation and quarantine. The movie star Denzel Washington posted something about this on Twitter, which I found to be absolutely wonderful. He said, I know a lot of you in quarantine, you're home, you're kind of frustrated because you haven't written the novel that you were going to write. In our case, we're going to write a technical paper. You haven't learned to play the piano. You haven't been doing your exercises. He says, I have good news for you. It's not over. Go back inside. And that has turned out to be so absolutely true. So let me tell you what I've been doing at home. Yeah, I have been playing the piano. I haven't been practicing. I'm sorry, I'm not just playing. I've been practicing things I never did before. I'm focusing on the great composers, the classics, Irving Berlin and Richard Rodgers. I love popular music. Looking forward to the next time I run into Ashley Hastings and we can play for each other. A lot of fun. And I've been exercising, of course. And I've also been working, of course. And I'm studying languages. I've been trying Benico Mason's ideas. I've been working on Spanish. And I know most people who are listening to this now have the same feelings I do. We are a very strange group. We love other languages. We love speaking them. We love acquiring them. We're very weird. I know that. And I'm just like you. And what I have learned in working on different languages has been magnificent. By the way, I do not speak Arabic, sorry. I know 2 other Semitic languages. So I'm ready for Arabic when it comes. I know Amharic, spoken in Ethiopia. I worked there for 2 years. And I know Hebrew, not just from synagogue, but also from living on a kibbutz in Israel. So it's just delightful doing all these languages. I'm working on Spanish now. And I have a collection of graded readers, easy. And my Spanish is kind of low intermediate. I know a lot of you can identify with this stage. I can have a conversation on a lot of topics, and it's not too bad. I have read one authentic novel, Isabella Allende, who's just marvelous, her novel called Zorro. It was a prequel of the Zorro adventures. It was really a little bit too hard, but she's such a good writer. She kind of pushes you along. It was very good. But I've been reading graded readers. I have a nice collection, and I've been reading a little bit of nonfiction. Well, the graded readers I have, my favorite author is a person some of you have heard of. His name is Bill Van Patten. He's a researcher in second language. He's also bilingual English-Spanish. His mom, Spanish speaker. And he writes wonderful stories in Spanish. I've told him that he's my favorite writer, hoping he'll send me free stuff, which he has, which is very nice. So I've been doing this every day. I've been reading very, very easy Spanish. I don't speak Spanish to anybody. I've been home. I haven't been going out. But I take a test once a week. I go to the supermarket, the same one, and I always get the same person to check out my groceries and pay for them. His name is Fidel, and he is originally from Mexico. The first time I was in line with him, I spoke to him in Spanish. He answered me, of course, in English, and I was ready for that. I repeated in Spanish. I said, my goal is to speak Spanish as well as you do. Y me metes a hablar español como ustedes. Y tú puedes ayudarme, you can help me. That really melted him. He had no resistance after that. I now speak Spanish to Fidel once a week when I go shopping. And he's a wonderful guy. We have a good time. And I've noticed this. He talks faster to me now. He uses more complicated vocabulary. We even joke around a little bit. Last time I was there a few days ago, I said, Fidel, I've noticed because I'm coming here so often, your Spanish is improving. And you're nearly perfect now. I'll continue and try to help you. Anyway, so we tell a few jokes. And I can tell I'm getting better without speaking. I only talk to Fidel once a week for maybe a minute. It's the reading. I can feel it. My advice to you, give in to temptation and go after that language that you're kind of intermediate in and find easy stuff. The problem is it's hard to find. You go to bookstores, you won't find easy stuff. You won't find much of anything. Here in the United States, you go to bookstores, you go to libraries, all you see is English. My colleague who is, I hope, listening to this now, Dr. Ashtari, has done the same thing with Farsi. Farsi is what we call a heritage language in the Los Angeles area. Children grow up with it. They hear Farsi at home, but it's not done in the schools, not done anywhere else. And and the emphasis is on English, and they gradually lose their competence in Farsi. We were interested in finding out if there is something to read for these kids. No, not much in the bookstores, very little. Dr. Ashtari did a very clever study, I think. She went to the computer and looked up in Los Angeles libraries, all 72 branches of the public libraries, how many books in the libraries are there in Farsi? Total for all of Los Angeles, 300. How many were taken out at the time she looked? Only 12. We complain that kids aren't doing the home language. There's nothing to read. That's the problem. Our major problem right now, access to books. I'm going to conclude by giving you a spectacular statistic, thanks to Beniko Mason. In her program that she worked with at her university, English as a foreign language, her students had access to 5,000 easy graded readers in English. That to me is inspirational. That's what we need to do. Yes, it does cost money if you buy the books in paperback. Costs the equivalent of $5 American, sometimes a little more. Better to get them off the computer, make it free, in my opinion. But even if it's $5 and you get 100 books and it's $500, we cheerfully spend that much on useless technology that is obsolete by the time you learn to use it. So number one, books, 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 books that are so interesting, students can't wait to get to them and can't wait to read the next one in the series. We supplement this eventually with authentic books that are also easy, and a lot of them, so students can take their choice. Well, I am going to stop here and ask if there are any questions. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dr. Krashen.
Okay.
I'll ask you if we can add 10 minutes just for questions and answers. I'll ask dear colleagues if you have any questions to write them in the chat box, and I will read it out for Doctor. Before turning to questions, I want to say one more thing. So Professor's commitment to improve second language acquisition research is exemplified in free webinars like this one here. So we are deeply grateful for your continuous commitment and generosity. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, my pleasure.
I'll start with my question first. So more than 50 years in second language research. You are recently advocating voluntary reading or pleasure reading, aesthetic reading, different terms. You wrote in a recent article, and I quote, "Free reading is the most powerful tool we have in language education, first and second." But my question as a teacher, how can we make ends meet? On the one hand, we have students' interests, students' needs, students' pleasure. But on the other hand, we do have the curriculum, the standardized tests. How can we actually, can we strike a balance, Professor?
Yes and no. First of all, here's the good news. If students are pleasure readers, they'll have no trouble with any of examinations. The best predictor of test scores over and over again is the amount of reading people do. I'll tell you about our major study. This, I think, could be the most important study I've ever done. I did two of them with colleagues Jeff McQuillan and Lee. We looked at what's called the PEARLS examination, which is this big international test given to 10-year-old children in 40 different countries throughout the world. They're tested in their own language. The best predictor was poverty, no question. That makes sense. Poverty means, sure, it means hunger, okay? Susan Ohanian's great motto, "No child left unfed." I love that. It means better medical care, and it also means more access to books. Children in poverty grow up with practically no books. They have fewer books in the home. They live in neighborhoods that don't have bookstores. They can't afford the books anyway. The libraries in poor neighborhoods are not nearly as good, etc. So they suffer from lack of access to books. Here's what we found in our statistical analysis. Yes, poverty was the big predictor. But if children had access to a library, usually a school library, in one of our studies, it totally balanced the effect of poverty. You supply the books and the kids read as if they're middle class. The second study was not quite as spectacular, but pretty good. The presence of a library made up for about 40% of the effect of poverty. So something we can do right away. So in terms of test scores, when kids are readers, they do much, much better on tests, and they'll do better on all subjects because free reading gives you that knowledge. This is not an endorsement of the tests. I think there's some tests that should be eliminated for the mental health of everybody. I think it's not a good idea to give speaking tests. And speaking tests are terrifying. Usually you're presented with a picture, you have to describe what's in the picture, it's recorded, or they give you an evaluation compared to the other graders. Number one, if you want to prepare for it, you practice speaking in class, but more speaking does not mean better speaking. That's output. We get better at speaking by listening and reading. Number two, it's very hard to do a speaking test. It's hard to get inter-rater reliability. Graders don't agree. Also, it's expensive. It takes time, it takes money. My suggestion, easy to reduce suffering, stop testing speaking. If you're going to test something, make sure it's reading, and kids will read more and they'll do better. I also think it's a bad idea to test writing. Writing style comes from reading. People who do well on reading comprehension typically do quite well in writing. Their writing style is okay. Practicing writing will not make you a more accurate writer. Now, practicing writing itself, writing has another virtue, and I'll take advantage of having the platform by telling you what it is, which has nothing. This virtue has nothing to do with better in language. Writing helps thinking. Writing makes you smarter. When you write something down and you reread it and you change it, you get better ideas, you grow intellectually. Writing helps problem solving. Everyone here knows about this. You have a personal problem. You have a misunderstanding with a friend or financial problem. What am I going to do with this? You write it down. Minimum 10% of the problem goes away just by clarifying it and writing it down. Writing helps thinking. Writing helps problem solving. Peter Elbow said this about writing. In writing, meaning is not what you start out with, it's what you end up with. It's revision that does it. You write it down, you reread it, you have a better idea. So I'm all in favor of writing, but you will not do better on writing tests. That comes from reading. Okay, that's the testing one. Next question, please.
Thank you, Professor. There's another question from teacher Tawfiq. Would reading and memorizing make more difference than just reading?
No, not reading and memorizing, just reading. The memorizing is automatic. Each time you see something new, you get a better idea of what it is and you gradually absorb it. We also cannot change the order of acquisition. And this I didn't talk about in the theory part, so I'll do it now. We know that grammar, and a large extent vocabulary, a lot of this is acquired in a certain order and you can't change it. Some things come early, some in the middle, some come late. We all know, English teachers, that the third person singular, I go, you go, he goes, is one of the last grammatical markers to be acquired. You can't change that. You can't hurry it up by memorizing it, practicing it over and over again. It will be acquired when its time has come. So there is no grammatical sequence. If we give people lots of comprehensible input, lots of interesting reading, they will acquire all the aspects of language in a certain order that cannot be changed. This makes life so much easier. Okay, next question.
Maybe
please.
one more question and we get it out from Ibrahim. How effective would incorporating a comprehension test in a program with graded readers?
Okay, if this is, I'm going to divide that into two separate questions. How about testing in a program with graded readers? If you want to test, I would give general global tests, a global test of reading comprehension, if you must test, okay? I would do that. I would not test them on what they've read. Testing people on what they've read is the best way to destroy interest in reading. Nobody will ever want to read again. My colleague Kung Suk Cho wrote a paper on this, and the title was something like, you want people to stop reading? Test them on what they've read. You can't do it. If you knew you were going to be tested on what you're reading, you'll barely be able to pay attention to the message. You want to get lost in the message. You want to get lost in the text, and you will remember, if it's interesting, you'll remember it without effort. So I think we don't want to do that. Okay, have we done it?
Wonderful, wonderful.
May
Well,
I invite
Professor,
you
I
to-
think, sorry.
May I invite you one more comment? Look at my website, sdkrashen.com, D as in David, my middle name, and look at ResearchGate, and you will find a lot of my articles free download. You may send them to anybody you like, including Donald Trump. That's okay with me. He won't read
Not
them.
only free download, but also short and compelling. 2 pages, 3 pages long. That's interesting,
Yeah,
Doctor.
that's the idea.
Thank you
That's
very much. Thank you, sir. I'll give it to Hamza to close in.
Aziz, thank you, Dr. Krashen. What a wonderful way to start our new academic year. You've given us a tremendous gift. We really, really appreciate it. And I just want to say 3 quick things. First, I'd like to thank Aziz Mumu, our dear brother and friend and colleague, for setting this up. Thank you so much, Sidi Aziz. Second, Dr. Krashen, you have a lifetime of free Arabic lessons at the Center for Language and Culture when you would like to start studying. Okay?
Shukran, Habibi.
Marhaban.
Okay.
And third, I want to say to our whole staff as we leave this orientation and we head off into this new year, I pray that we can see this year truly as an opportunity, this term especially as we're teaching online mostly, as an opportunity rather than seeing it as a difficulty. And this meeting that we just had with Dr. Krashen is an example of that, that for years we would have loved to have Dr. Krashen come to us in Marrakesh and have him grace us with his presence and his ideas, but we never could do that. And now, because of the situation, here he is with us and sharing his heart and his mind with us, and we appreciate it so much. And so I hope that all of you can take this idea that this time is one now of opportunity and newness and growth, and we hope to take these ideas forward for this coming term. So thank you to everyone, and especially Dr. Krashen for your time. Jazakumullahu khairan, and have a wonderful evening to everyone. Thank you, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.